You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is sponsored by PCS Jobs. APN listeners can post for free by going to arcpodnet.com/PCS. That's $50 off the normal price at www.arcpodnet.com/PCS.
So, welcome to Heritage Voices, Episode 5. I'm Jessica Uquinto, and I'm your host today. And today we have Dr. Holly Norton, and we're going to be talking about SHPOs, tribal consultation, and collaboration.
Holly Norton is the Colorado State Archaeologist and the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer for Colorado. She received her PhD from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, where she focused on historical archaeology, specifically African American slavery and conflict events. She also holds an MA in anthropology from Syracuse University and a BA in anthropology from the University of South Carolina. Holly has a wide range of previous experience, including working for the South Carolina Department of Transportation, Virgin Islands National Park, History Colorado, as well as in academia and for private consulting firms. She has served as the communication director for the General Anthropology Division of the American Anthropological Association and on the editorial advisory committee of the Society for Historical Archaeology. So thank you for being here today, Holly.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to have Holly on today because I really think this is going to be a really great background episode for a lot of people. I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily know exactly what SHPOs do and how that relates to tribal consultation and archaeology, ethnography, etc. So I just think it'll be a really great sort of background info for people, or just, for people that do have more experience in these kinds of fields, just a little bit of humanization, I guess, of the SHPO.
Yeah, we kind of are like that big, bad, monolithic government agency that nobody quite knows what to do with, but everybody knows they don't like.
So I guess that would be a good place to start with, what does the SHPO do?
Well, I'm glad you asked. So really, basically, the SHPOs exist to carry out the NHPA duties that are really the advisory councils, but the advisory council is a very small federal agency, and they're all in DC, and so they have difficulty doing all the different things that they would need to do to help ensure that the NHPA, the National Historic Preservation Act, is met. And so it was delegated to states at this kind of state level with the State Historic Preservation Officer. And so really we're here to help federal agencies facilitate and meet their responsibilities under the National Historic Preservation Act, is us in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. So what does that actually look like on a daily basis?
That is a really good question. So what that should look like, and I say should meaning, like technically according to the regs, not necessarily should as in what's kind of the best for historic resources, but an agency, always a federal agency, has some sort of undertaking that they initiate through our office. And then we start consultation, and we are supposed to consult from the beginning. So agencies are supposed to say, hey, we've got an idea for this project. We think this will be the area of potential effect, the APE. What do you guys think? And then we come back and we say, no, we think your APE should be bigger, because we always think it should be bigger. And then it goes from there. How it usually happens in reality is a federal agency has a great idea for a project. They do the project, they decide what their APE is, and not necessarily they do the project to completion, but they go out and they do their survey and they look at their historic buildings and their archaeological sites, and they come back to us and they say, hey, we did all this work, now what do you guys think? And so they usually skip to like step 2 or 3. Which is okay. I mean, it works sometimes. It's only when it doesn't work that it becomes a problem. And then we start consultation from there. And a lot of it is still with Colorado, although we're moving away from this, formal letters that are hard copy letters. And so somebody sits down and writes our SHPO a letter and puts it in a packet full of papers and snail mails it to us. And then we deal with all that on our end and snail mail them back a letter. And for the most part, consultations, especially in Colorado, I think they go pretty smoothly. We've got really good relationships with most of our agencies, and it's a really small community. So everybody kind of knows each other. We know what's going on in different places. And so that's a typical day for us.
So this kind of reminds me of something similar, what you said, to the situation with consultation with tribes. So there's consultation with SHPO and there's consultation with tribes. And you're mentioning that you feel like a lot of times you don't get brought in until several steps in.
Yes.
And I know obviously that happens all the time to tribes as well, where they're not brought in until probably way later than they should be. But So I guess my question is, though, and you mentioned this so Holly was actually also on the CRM Archaeology podcast, episode 99, Environmental Policy in the Age of Trump, which you should definitely check out if you haven't yet. It's a really good one, and they touch on a lot of tribal consultation issues. But like you mentioned in that episode, tribes are swamped.
Yes.
And I imagine that probably the SHPO is swamped too.
Yeah. Yes, we are. Thank you for noticing.
Yes. So there's so much talk about bringing in, having consultation be more meaningful and more every step along the way. But is that something that's really attainable, I guess, from a SHPO perspective, to bring in the SHPO every step of the way?
You know what? Yes. And I think from a tribal perspective too, and if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of tack back and forth between what I think about tribe and SHPO. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's this perception, and it's not necessarily unfair, that people are moving along with their project and they bring SHPO in and the SHPO throws a monkey wrench into it. We don't agree with something, or we want them to go back and redo something or to slow down on something. And I think that a lot of the issues that most people have with the SHPO's office could be avoided if they had consulted the SHPO earlier and more often. So if you start with the APE, that's such a huge thing. Like the APE is literally like the most basic step of initiating Section 106. What is my area of potential effect? Where do I have the potential to affect historic resources in my project? And if the SHPO doesn't agree with the agency, even on where the APE is, then nothing else is going to line up. And if you've already done your survey, if you've had a crew out there for a week or a month or however long, and you come back and the SHPO says, well, I don't even think that's where you should have been, like everything falls apart from there.
Right.
And I think it's the same thing with tribes. A lot of times when I'm speaking with my tribal colleagues, the frustrations I hear from them is that they're brought in towards the end of a project, and not with everybody. And I tried to make this point in the other podcast as well, is that there are agencies and there are individuals within agencies who have this down and they do tribal consultation really well. But from what I hear, the biggest complaint from our tribal partners is they're brought in after all the decisions have been made. And so they're kind of asked to give a rubber stamp of yay or nay on the project.
Right.
And that's not consultation, right? That's seeking consent or checking off a box.
Right. So, okay, going off of that a little bit, I mean, first of all, yeah, what you're saying is so true, like you said, with both SHPO consultation and tribal consultation, because when you look at the cases that have really blown up with tribal consultation, and there's lawsuits and all of these kinds of things, half the time it seems like they could have been avoided very early on, but by the time it gets to that point, the tribes are pissed, first of all, because they've been completely disrespected and not included. And, it's just totally unnecessary, basically. But anyway, moving on from there, I want to touch a little bit on what exactly the role of the SHPO is then related to tribal consultation. Because, I mean, I imagine to some extent you are doing your own consultation, but at the same time, basically you're overseeing these federal agencies' consultations. Is that correct?
Yeah, kind of, yeah. So where our role is in consultation gets really weird.
Okay.
So our office does its own consultations, but usually not for like federal NHPA related projects. We have State Register Act here in Colorado, as well as relationships between different state agencies and tribes. And so we do a lot of consultation around that, around things like unmarked burials in NAGPRA. Our SHPO office is also in the State Museum, and so we have museum-related consultations that, because of these complicated relationships we have, where we have lots of moving parts and a lot of different things that are related, even though they don't necessarily fall under the same legal umbrella, we're one big happy family at History Colorado, and so we'll get involved in museum consultations as well sometimes. So federal agencies under the National Historic Preservation Act are allowed to delegate a ton of stuff to consultants, to proponents for projects, to other stakeholders. The only thing that they are not allowed to delegate is the government-to-government relationship with tribes and tribal consultation.
Right.
So that's kind of like this really special sacred relationship for feds. So as SHPO, we remind our federal partners that they need to consult. And we're often, depending on what's being consulted on, we are often in the room for like a programmatic agreement or, some really big consultation. But for the most part, especially the land managing agencies that we work with who consult with tribes frequently, they take that really seriously and they keep us out of it. So that they have their own relationships that they maintain through different yearly meetings or different types of consultations. And we may or may not get notification of those. Where I think our role really does come in is with other federal agencies who maybe don't have those long-term relationships with partners, reminding them when they need to consult and, how they need to consult and what that should look like realistically on the ground is something that we do and we can try to help facilitate. So it gets weird because we don't have a specific role, but I think like other stakeholder communities, sometimes the tribes do look to us to keep the process true and to keep everybody honest.
Right. You mentioned other stakeholder groups, and that I think is an often ignored point. People are better on the tribal consultation side of things, but forgetting that there are other groups that may have interests in historic properties that are not tribes. And obviously the relationship is different, but those groups often get ignored as well. So what are some examples in Colorado of other groups that federal agencies are working with?
So federal agencies in Colorado, especially again, like the land managing agencies. So people like the Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, Forest Service, the folks who have like huge swaths of this state, they work oftentimes with county commissioners. That's a huge group that gets consulted with on projects out here. We also have a really robust certified local government program, CLGs. Oftentimes those groups will also be consulting partners or, local historic commissions. Sometimes we get historical societies, not always. I think that you're right. They're the sorts of groups that are kind of easily forgotten or easily overlooked. They don't necessarily have the political clout that like a county commissioner would. Mm-hmm. And then there are other descending groups. So we give tribes a special status, and they totally should have one because of their sovereign government status.
Right.
But then there's other descendant communities that aren't necessarily organized in that way because they don't have a government. They might have a local historical or like society culture chapter or group that can kind of speak for them, but it's still not, I don't want to say homogenous because the government to government thing isn't either, but it can be a little bit more ambiguous about who to get around the table and if you're being inclusive enough. But I'm really thinking of things like I worked a lot in the Southeast and, African American communities and in African descendant communities. Out here, a lot of like Hispanic and Latino communities. These are groups that have really rich histories and are often really involved in different cultural resource projects, but there's not that official person to go to. And so I think that can be hard for agencies to figure out how to get them involved in the conversation in a meaningful way.
Right. Or even the descendants of the Japanese.
Oh, that's a great example. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Like with the Japanese internment camp out on the Eastern Plains.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, or even, for example, you may have a historic property where you may have a family and you may have direct descendants, and it may not be a community necessarily, but it still may be a conversation that needs to be had.
Yes. And that's a really great example coming from our museum. We actually have an exhibit on Bent's Fort here at the History Colorado Center in Denver. And there's the real Bent's Fort, of course. It's a national park. It's a national historic site out on the Eastern Plains. It's a great site. If nobody has been there, I definitely think you should go. I was actually just there last week. But we had an interpretation about Kit Carson where Kit Carson's nephew, like direct descendant, didn't think it was fair or accurate, and he hadn't been included in the original conversation. And so we've recently redone that exhibit, and we've included those sorts of interpretations and, thought about the fact that our historical figures were real people, and they are real people, even to living communities and living descendants. Like there are people who have a memory and a connection to those folks that we think of as having existed an awfully long time ago.
Right. Well, and right now we are at a good stopping point for our first break. And then when we come back, I want to dive a little bit more into your background and some things that you've done along the way.
Great.
All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology, but we don't do dinosaurs.
Did aliens build Stonehenge? Did the Easter Island statues walk? Did the Vikings colonize Midwest America? What does mainstream archaeology have to say about all of this? Listen to the Archaeological Fantasies podcast and learn about popular archaeological mysteries. Hoax or fact? Learn to tell the difference with Dr. Kenneth Fader and co-host Sarah of the Archae Fantasies blog. Check out the show on iTunes and Stitcher Radio and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/Archae Fantasies and get ready to think critically. Let's get back to the show.
Funny beady blokes you will see are a staple of archaeology.
All right, and we are back. So I do want to touch, again, because I think it's really important to have that humanizing aspect. So I do want to get a little bit more into your background and how did you get interested in this field?
I will start out by saying that I actually really like policy work. I think the government part of archaeology, I know it makes me really wonky and nerdy, but I think it's really fun and interesting because I think even though I'm not as involved directly in research as some of our colleagues are, I think that we get some really interesting work done, and I love the collaborative aspect of it. And part of the whole reason that I ended up here and that I even knew that I liked this is that, as a student, I'd always wanted to be an archaeologist. I did anthropology as an undergrad, worked in archaeology almost immediately after getting out of school. And my first job was actually with the Department of Transportation in South Carolina, which is where I first really learned about 106. I had taken a policy course as an undergrad, but I think it's hard to wrap your head around until you're actually doing it. And that was a lot of fun, although I look back on things now and I'm sure we did not always do 106 correctly. But then, I did go back to grad school and I did have a research trajectory. But I took the path that was not always recommended in grad school, in that while I was a student, I went and I worked for CRM companies, to piece together rent and meals and tuition from semester to semester, taught when and where I could. I worked for the National Park while I was working on my dissertation. I was really fortunate. My dissertation question was at a National Park site. And so I was there for a few summers volunteering, and then they hired me temporarily, which really allowed me to get my research done. And so all of that kind of really disparate experience, I actually credit with landing here, because I'm not sure, thinking about it, I'm not sure how you could have a direct path to this. to this. I was able to have a really broad understanding of archaeology, which I think is really necessary if you're going to be working at any level of government, whether it's for a federal agency or even if you're working for a private contracting firm where you're constantly working on a different type of project. I think having a broad understanding and a lot of different experiences helps a lot more than having that very specific, narrow research focus that we're often directed to have as graduate students.
Going to your research from grad school, one question that comes up for me is, so you were in the U.S. Virgin Islands,
yes,
and working with descendant slave communities, right? Or, well, you were looking at slavery at least.
Yes.
Did you get a chance to work with descendant communities at all, or just living at the park? Did you get to collaborate with the local communities in any capacity?
I did a little bit, but not as much as I probably should have, looking back on it. Mm-hmm. So my research question was actually on a slave rebellion that occurred in 1733. And back then, in 1733, the U.S. Virgin Islands were the Danish West Indies. So it was a Danish island. The United States acquired it in 1917, and it's its own fascinating history related to like Germany and World War I, and we can talk about that some other time, but it's really cool. But I was interested in the slave rebellion on this teeny tiny little island. It's only about 20 square miles, and this rebellion lasted for about 8 months. And so the challenge really was trying to figure out how to even approach this archaeologically, because it didn't really leave much of an archaeological assemblage. Mm-hmm. There is still a very strong descendant community on St. John, which is the island that I worked on. In the Virgin Islands, they're West Indians, and their identity is usually, oftentimes, and this is really broad strokes, African slaves and local indigenous people, kind of this, and with European descent. So it's really this kind of broad multi-ethnic descendant community. They historically and today, they kind of view those racial divisions differently than we do in the United States. They didn't have things like the one drop rule. So there's a much more of a component of this kind of multi-ethnic, multinationalist descendants. And they do have a really strong history of the rebellion. For me as a student, trying to grapple with all those different aspects, I worked with them a bit, but not as collaboratively as some of the consultations that we're talking about that occur today in Colorado. And they also have, the West Indians in the USVI have a really strong kind of history ethos. A lot of people are educators. A lot of people have, a lot of the community leaders have history degrees and are leaders in interpreting their own culture. And so I really was also able to benefit from having a lot of written documentation that they had produced themselves about the event. So it was working a little bit more with colleagues on that level. I think going back and doing more ethnography about different aspects of that rebellion and the history of the island because of it would be interesting, but it's not anything that I've approached yet.
And that's always something that I feel like is really, really important, that aspect of having the community tell these histories. So, this example, or also the Pueblo Revolt in New Mexico, which is a story that the community can tell about themselves and things that they were doing before there was a United States.
Yes.
And those aspects of history in the United States so often get ignored. So it's really great when you hear of local communities really taking that on themselves.
Well, and I feel like if you don't have the local communities taking that on, it often becomes a white man's military history.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean that specifically, like a white man's. It becomes male and military, and these were the maneuvers, and it's a lot is lost in that. Military history is important, but you lose that humanness and those basic cultural questions that I think as anthropologists, what we're really here for and what we're interested in.
Right. And that, oh, hey, that's somebody that did something big that looks like me.
Right.
The representation aspect.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, okay, I want to talk a little bit about this transition. You mentioned when you were working on your PhD that looking back, it wasn't maybe as collaborative as you would have liked. So can we talk about the transition into more and more collaborative work that you do today?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. And I'll start by going back a little bit. Part of the reason I probably wasn't as collaborative, I wasn't always comfortable being collaborative. Like I used to joke that I preferred my people dead because, right, like I'm not a cultural anthropologist. Like I don't want to do ethnography. I don't want to go out and talk to people. Like just give me a shovel and go away.
Yeah.
I think that for the most part, in this position in particular, I don't think I had a choice. I think in order to be successful in any state historic preservation office or to be a successful state archaeologist, I needed to get over that aversion to working with people immediately. And so it was less of a transition than it was. I kind of forced myself into an immediate change in mindset where, this wasn't about personal research or whatever those reasons are we have for doing specific projects, that in the positions that I was in, as kitschy as it sounds, I served the people of Colorado. And that means that I needed to work with as many different groups as possible to see where the values and meaning of our cultural resources was and how best to protect and interpret those resources. Because, in all honesty, SHPOs in a lot of ways don't have much power. Like we can't do these things. Where our power comes in, hopefully, is in building relationships, especially with local people who can do the research or do the interpretations or protect sites through various ways. And empower them to do those things. So pretty much it was just, telling myself that if this was a job I really wanted to do, that mind shift had to change.
Right. And I feel like that happens a lot, where basically people get thrown from a field archaeologist position into more of an admin or a higher level type position, where all of a sudden they're expected to collaborate, but given no training or really tools to help them do that. So what advice would you give to other people facing similar situations?
Well, I think one of the things that helped me is that I was fortunate to, and this is not something that anybody can control, but I was fortunate to be at History Colorado in the SHPO's office doing 106 for about 8 months before I became state archaeologist. And doing 106 from a SHPO side, there is more collaboration than necessarily doing it from like a CRM side, or maybe even sometimes depending on the level in an agency, because I was on the phone with federal people or with tribes or with other stakeholders, about different aspects. And so I think that kind of did help transition. But for folks who don't have a position like that, you are absolutely correct. We don't have a lot of training in school of how to do this. And then when you kind of work your way up through a company or an agency, these are not huge staffs. And so there's not a lot of time to get trained or, a lot of other resources to teach you how to do these things. And I think developing relationships, if you don't already have them, with people who've been in your position. So I've been really fortunate. I knew and I worked with the person who was the state archaeologist before me, Richard Wilshusen, and he was wonderful, and he and I have remained friends. And then after I took on this position, I've been really fortunate to develop relationships with two of the previous state archaeologists, Susan Collins and Bruce Ripito, for various reasons. Susan was kind enough to reach out to me, and we've developed a really friendly professional relationship. And then Bruce just happened to call one day. He was looking for an old report from something that they had done when he was here. And he's just this friendly, boisterous guy. And so luckily, I think it was just a personality thing where we got to talking. And so now we speak every few months if we have the opportunity. But not being afraid to rely on people who have been in your shoes before and asking them questions, and just going to them sometimes with issues. How did you handle X, Y, or Z? And, what would you recommend dealing with this type of situation or this type of relationship? Or, hey, why did you make that decision? I know this thing happened. Why did you do it that way? And that can be really helpful and really insightful. And so I've been really fortunate to have those relationships. And I think I'm really fortunate to have a really good staff of folks, some of whom were just like my colleagues for the 8 months before I took this job. And so now to say that I'm like their supervisor is just weird, because it's much more collaborative than that. I think of it more almost like an academic department where it's, a bunch of professors who all have different interests, but kind of a meeting of equals more than the weird hierarchical thing that you can actually get in state agencies. So I'm really fortunate to have really smart people with a lot of experience who've been around History Colorado and the state of Colorado for a while and can help me figure things out, or just do it, because in reality, they do their jobs really, really well without a lot of intervention from the deputy SHPOs or the SHPO. So they know what they're doing.
Okay, so we are at time for our second break. And then when we get back, I'm going to have a follow-up question.
Okay.
Women in Archaeology is a show about archaeology by the women of archaeology. An alternating panel of women archaeologists discuss the issues in archaeology that impact professionals and the public every day. Check out Women in Archaeology for a different perspective on the past today at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/WIA. Now let's get back to the show.
All right, and we are back. So one thing that I feel like, okay, so there's very little training for people wanting to work in tribal consultation. But I feel like there's even less training for tribes to work with federal agencies and state agencies, SHPOs, etc. You know, because like you said, there's a whole lot of bureaucracy. Actually, you might have said this on the other podcast. Now that I think, but I'm not sure if you said it today. But you know, there's a whole lot of culture there. There's a lot of bureaucratic culture. Then there's American culture, which, you know, people don't think that Americans have culture, but in grad school, I remember we read something once that said, it was an Italian ethnographer, I think, and she said, the most consistent cultural trait of Americans is that they deny having a culture.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, because people always think of culture as, you know, oh, the Utes, they had beadwork and they did the bear dance, and it's very focused on material culture or events or stories, but it's this ignoring of the fact that what culture really is it's how you look at the world and the way that you interact with the world, and those things come out of that. Mm-hmm. But that culture in its essence is a lot more than that. It's a lot deeper than that. And so people working in tribal consultation a lot of times will say, well, basically, whether they mean to or not, they'll put the tribes as the problem. Like, oh, well, basically your culture is what's preventing this from happening. As opposed to, here's two cultures clashing, and we have to both look at what's happening here and see how we can move forward.
Yeah.
So that's a long way of asking. For tribes, what would you recommend to them on how they could best work with SHPOs, with federal agencies? What would be some tricks for them?
Ooh, okay. So, yeah, there's a lot there.
Right, I just like threw you at a doozy right there.
Well, so I think that some of the tribes that I see that are the most successful at this, they are very proactive in reaching out to SHPOs or to agencies and kind of keeping their finger on the pulse of things. Where that is problematic is that puts the onus back on them, right? And it shouldn't just be about the tribes being like, hey, just to remind you, we'd like to consult on stuff. Like, we want to be involved. It really, the bureaucratic apparatus really should be doing its job, but I don't think it helps to have a nudge from the tribes. That's also problematic because you're right. And I think, like I did say in the other podcast, is that the resources for THPOs, and not every tribe is a THPO, but resources for THPOs is so much smaller than the pot of resources for SHPOs. And so to put that into context, and these numbers have changed slightly with the new budget, but I don't know them off the top of my head. But as of like 2 weeks ago, there are the SHPOs, and I think a couple of like the territorial SHPOs. So like USVI and Puerto Rico has its own SHPO, and like Guam. We all split a pot of HPF money that's, I believe, $43 million. There's 171 THPOs that split $9 million.
Right.
Yeah. So, which is insane when you think about it in those contexts.
Right.
Another thing that I am seeing from the THPOs or the tribes who seem to be the most successful in that they're actually able to have like influential and meaningful collaborations is they're finding different ways to get the training that isn't otherwise easy to come by. And so I know that there's actually a couple of tribal colleges that are now offering like CRM and THPO courses and degrees. And so people are able to get this training that, you know, isn't available in a mainstream American university for the most part with anthropology departments and stuff, although departments are starting to do that.
Mm-hmm.
There are different grant opportunities with the National Park Service to get different sorts of resources and relationships with SHPOs. And so we actually had a grant that just finished up this past year, came out of that positive train control lawsuit where the railroads did not do Section 106 the way they were supposed to. And so they had this huge pot of money. We got a grant out of that money, as well as several other SHPOs, where we worked with, I believe, both of our Ute tribes, where we got a bunch of data digitized for them so that they could take their own cultural data like out of our site files and back to their tribe. And then we did some training, even just like basic training on and getting equipment and, you know, accessing different databases, things that they might not otherwise have access to, or that may have taken like longer to get access to or longer to learn. So I think those are really key components, just like for the SHPO offices, is just looking for the few opportunities that do exist, taking advantage of them when they come up. But I also think a lot of SHPOs, at least a lot of the folks I know, we all have limited capacity. We all wish we had more money and more time. Right. And more staff, but I think we all are willing and able to do different types of trainings or different types of relationships where we can share data or share resources or go down and give a Section 106 training to youth so that more people understand, you know, the sorts of job opportunities that exist or that they could create.
One thing that you mentioned that I had been thinking about earlier a lot was, so you're talking about the SHPOs and the Historic Preservation Fund, which funds both the SHPOs and the THPOs.
Yes.
And the SHPOs, and obviously you were part of that big push last year to make sure that was reauthorized. And then this most recent budget that will go till September, there was an increase for both the SHPOs and the THPOs, although the THPOs got, it looks like, half what the SHPOs did.
Yeah.
And that, the way that it had been explained to me before, the way I understood it was that basically there was a pot of money set aside for THPOs, and that the number of THPOs keeps growing, but that pot doesn't keep growing, basically.
Yes.
For the most part.
That's my understanding. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in September, when we're all going to be lobbying for the Historic Preservation Fund, and people call their congressmen and senators, etc., make sure to mention that you specifically want additional funding for the THPOs.
Yeah.
So that they can do all those great things that they're doing, and that they don't, you know, like the oil and gas companies or these other people want things to move through faster. And, you know, if we just paid the THPOs a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Things would move faster. So
well, I know. And that's what kills me is I hear, and this has been a dog whistle for like 20, 30 years, longer than I've been doing archaeology. But people talk about streamlining. We need to streamline 106. Well, we don't need to streamline 106. We need to, A, do 106 properly so that we're not holding ourselves up. And B, yeah, if we just funded the THPOs or the tribes or whoever it is who needs to be at the table, if you can give them the resources to be there instead of like struggling just to get basic paperwork done because they have one person in their office, then
And
yeah.
literally stacks upon stacks upon stacks of letters.
Yes, absolutely. I was at a consultation last week with some tribes, and there was a gentleman who was telling me about his first day as president of his tribe. He had just been elected, and they were like, here's your office. And it was, like worse than my office. He said it was like a backroom closet. And he walks in, and there's a stack of mail that nobody had gotten to because, they'd been having elections and the last president left. And the first thing he opened was a request from a federal agency about a site that became a traditional cultural property. And it said, this is the third and final notice. We've been trying to reach your tribe. We're going to move forward, but we'd like to consult on this property. And that if he hadn't opened it that day and called, maybe it was the Smithsonian or something, and called the Smithsonian and said, yes, we want to be involved, they would have missed their opportunity. And for no other reason than they didn't have enough people to answer the mail.
Right.
That's insane. And that is not how we should be operating as government agencies. Yeah, we should be giving somehow, somebody somewhere, there is enough in this country that our tribal governments should not have to struggle just to be part of these basic discussions.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, that's my soap.
So on a very, very different note, something that has been coming up a lot lately is this concept of confidentiality versus FOIA requests. So I've gotten this, I know, right? And I don't think we're going to solve this one today since nobody. But, a lot lately, I've been hearing about this from tribes and from federal agencies, this idea that the tribes really want to share, and they want to share with the federal agencies, but they're afraid of FOIA requests. That they're okay with the people that are managing their ancestral territories having access to this protected knowledge, but even that, honestly, is a stretch for them culturally. So to stretch it to the entire American public is not acceptable. Do you think that there's any way to work around this? I mean, usually what we end up doing is more of a, honestly, we can't guarantee. So anything that you're sharing, you should be comfortable with just in case if it got FOIA requested, that it be included, which is not ideal, but that's how it is. From your experience, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. And so one of the things that we often fall back on here, and that we're very strict about in this office, is that there are laws that both at the state and the federal level that protect cultural information. And so it's actually not locational information, and this isn't blanket, it mostly has to do with locational information. So if there's other information about a historic site or a traditional cultural property that tribes don't want out in the public, not all of that would be protected, but cultural resources are by and large immune from FOIA requests. I am careful to say that because we're in a weird political climate right now. 6 months ago, I would have had no problem saying absolutely not, these will never be subject to FOIA requests. We have this kind of sacred sense of locational data in this country in terms of our cultural resources. Pretty much anything seems up for grabs right now. And so to give tribes kind of that cautionary, or anybody kind of cautionary statement of nothing is 100% guaranteed, I think is prudent. But there becomes a larger issue to that then. So for better or for worse, the way that we manage and protect things is through these bureaucratic processes.
Right.
If we don't have that information within our bureaucratic mechanisms and infrastructure, then it often can't even be part of the conversation. And so that's where I struggle and where I see people struggling, because I think that the tribes are wise to not always want to divulge or share, even with trusted, federal agencies or a trusted SHPO or whomever it may be. But at the same time, we can't manage information that we don't have. And so it becomes this weird navigation and this weird dance. And what the answer to that is, I don't know. Other than I would hope that as a community, we can keep our laws strong and that we can have these conversations, where we're saying this type of information needs to be off limits and can never be part of FOIA requests. And, we need to come to some agreements as a community how we're going to handle this information and these different types of information so that we're both being sensitive, but also good stewards of the resources. From my actual experience, what I see is very, very seasoned cultural folks in the tribes, people who've been working in this system oftentimes for decades, who understand those navigations better than I do at this point. And I see them and talk to them about it, making these compromises, which has been really interesting. But yeah, and I think it's always going to be a moving target as well. And it's different from tribe to tribe and different from, so there's so much that goes into it. Yeah, so that's interesting that keeps coming up as a conversation for you.
Right. Well, and my hope with it more is maybe that we can continue to raise awareness about it, and ultimately that maybe on a more legislative level or
yes,
a higher level that there would ultimately be a solution there, like you're saying.
Yeah, we need it to be legislative, and we need a strong commitment from our executive and congressional branches of the federal government is where it needs to come from. It can't just be on the agencies or on like the DOI or the SHPOs. There's got to be a larger
or the individual people within those agencies that are doing their best to do right by the tribes.
Absolutely. I mean, even the most seasoned and well-meaning, strong person, how long are they going to be in their position? 20 years, 30 years? Like, they have a finite amount of time in that agency. Right.
Yeah.
That was
okay. Yeah, so let's switch to something a little bit lighter or more positive, I guess. So based on the collaborative or the tribal consultation work that you've been doing more lately, what have you seen that has been really creative or successful in making those work, or just really creative, effective outcomes, highlights, etc.?
So from a SHPO point of view, since so many of our really strong federal partners have their own relationships with the tribes, I unfortunately don't have a lot of great examples from that point of view. I do have, there's been some good work going on just with museums and other institutions who I think they're not legislatively mandated to collaborate with tribes the way, a federal agency is over a Section 106 sort of thing. But to see how much tribal collaboration has become part of just basic best practices over the last, especially 10 years, I think has been really exciting. And I think we've got some museums who are doing some like really interesting, good work. We've been working really closely with folks from the Sand Creek Massacre site. This is kind of an open secret, but a couple of years ago when History Colorado Center first opened, we had an exhibit on the Sand Creek Massacre that was not well received and was actually not collaborated on the way it should have been. It didn't undergo consultation the way consultation should go. And we kind of hit the restart button. And I was fortunate enough to kind of come in at that restart. Our old administration left, and I was part of a group of new folks who came in. And I think some of the most rewarding aspects of that have been the personal relationships and seeing how far the kind of this web of collaboration and the different aspects that go into this one event, like how far they stretch. Yeah, so we're working on this great new exhibit for Sand Creek, and it's probably still a couple of years out, but the conversations that we've been having around this have been just really interesting and really fulfilling, and have kind of gone beyond, well, let's talk about Sand Creek and what happened there, which is probably the most important aspect, but also these larger conversations of how do we talk about the Cheyenne and the Arapaho peoples, who they were, who they are, how they're still here, which is a huge thing that people seem to miss in mainstream America, is that Native Americans.
No.
That's a whole other topic.
Right.
Right? Like they're still here. They're our neighbors and our
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, and I think that I think one of the great things about Colorado is the Colorado Commission for Indian Affairs, which is another state agency. It's a sister agency. And again, they're a really strong agency. They're understaffed. Give them some resources, people, if you're listening. The director is Ernest House Jr., and he's just amazing. And so he has really done this amazing job of not only building really strong relationships with lots of different agencies, including History Colorado and the 2 Ute tribes that here in Colorado that have reservations, but also the urban Indian population, which is really diverse and really, involved in different business activities and cultural activities, and is this modern group of human beings that people are really happy to overlook, but are really involved in just huge aspects of what's going on in Denver and in Colorado. So that's been a really interesting thing for me to observe and kind of participate on the periphery, but something that, as History Colorado, we like to think of ourselves as really strong partners with CCIA, and so we try to involve different aspects of all sorts of Indian American life into different activities and programs here. So things like that. I think it's going back to your question from, and sorry, I'm rambling again, but I think things might not always be very innovative or creative at the SHPO level. I'm not saying that they're not. Some people are coming up with some really cool stuff. I just can't think of any off the top of my head. But what I really think is interesting right now about tribal consultation is that it's kind of getting into multiple aspects of life. It's not just the mandated Section 106 consultations, but it's our cultural institutions, it's our businesses, it's all different sorts of aspects, other agencies, things that are going on with the Department of Education, trying to get more Ute programming into the curriculum, a lot of different things like that. That's what I think is exciting right now.
Yes, I love that. Okay.
I got there eventually.
Yes. No, I love that. I love that, and I also love it's funny because so I'm working on that NSF STEM project with History Colorado.
Oh,
helping
that's
out
great.
through DARG,
Yes.
which is the Dominguez Anthropological Research Group.
I
And
know them.
so they always have the Ute Indian Museum meetings basically right after or before the NSF STEM meetings. So in some ways, it feels like I've kind of gotten to watch that process. There's been, they've had a lot of meetings and done a lot of work together, the Ute tribes and History Colorado, on the Ute Indian Museum out of Montrose, Colorado.
Yes.
And it opens June 10th, I believe, right?
Yes. So there's the tribal day for anybody, and I don't know when this will air, but there's a tribal day on June 9th that is just for tribes, but I think they want people to participate. And then June 10th is the grand opening for the public. So I haven't been out there in a while, but they've done, it sounds like, an amazing job on the new building, some really cool exhibits that I'm excited for us to see.
Yeah, the building, I got to get a little bit of a sneak peek, and it's gorgeous.
Oh, that's so exciting.
I'm really excited, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And then the other part that you touched on, you had mentioned that, because there's 2 Ute tribes in Colorado, and then obviously there's a Ute tribe that originally was in Colorado, and part of them were originally in Colorado and part of them were originally in Utah. And now they're in Utah. And this, I feel like, comes up all of the time working with tribes. The fact that there are tribes that are in different states than their ancestral homelands. They may have covered multiple states, or they may have been relocated forcibly.
Right.
And they may be very far geographically from their ancestral ties. So as a SHPO for one state, does that have any kind of impact working with, obviously there's a lot of tribal communities that you work with in other states?
Yes. Yeah, so this is something that I'm actually really proud of as a Coloradan, even as a transplant Coloradan, and I can't take any credit for this, but I will definitely tout History Colorado, our NAGPRA liaison and our archaeology curator here at History Colorado. She and her predecessors really have done a lot to reach out to all of the tribes who identify all or part of the state of Colorado as ancestral homelands. And I should add that CCIA has been instrumental in this as well. Right now, we have 48 tribes that we will actively engage in consultations with because of that kind of self-identification of Colorado as being part of their ancestral homelands. It's an interesting relationship because the kind of federally mandated legally part of tribal relationships, I think, and most people don't really follow this anymore, so I could be a little off. This was how a lot of people interpreted it back east. But you only have to work with your federally mandated tribes, or your federally recognized tribes, which would be our 2 Ute tribes. Because there's these 48 other tribes, or these 46 other tribes, 48 total, but most of them, like you said, do live outside of the state of Colorado for different sorts of activities and processes, like our unmarked burial process. They've developed these relationships with each other and with our agencies where they're still active and consulting and engaged, but in certain things, the 2 Ute tribes do take kind of the lead to help kind of facilitate things from a tribal point of view. So it's a really interesting dynamic. It can make things a little bit more complicated just because You don't want to assume always who you do and you don't contact. Sometimes people will ask, well, I'm in this area, which tribes should I talk to? And they really want like a black and white answer of, well, just these guys, and then you don't have to worry about those other guys.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, our answer is always, well, there's 48. Here's the list. Here's the here's the THPOs or the cultural folks. And you really should contact all of them. And I'm just going to stop there because it's just that complicated. But it's fun. It's interesting. Like I've had really interesting conversations with different tribes from other states and their relationships with our state versus their relationships with their own state, or even been in consultations with multiple tribes and how their history relates to each other and how they talk about it, their historical relationships, their contemporary relationships.
Right.
It just makes it makes it a little bit more complicated, but it makes it so much more interesting and so much more just kind of deeper and richer for the state.
Right. Right. And then, like you mentioned, I mean, there's tribes that chose as an act of resistance not to become federally recognized.
Right.
And there are state recognized tribes and all kinds of different permutations of the above. But basically, I feel like when you get down to it, like we talked about before, if they're interested, they should be included, basically.
Exactly.
Whether that's a government-to-government relationship, like a federally recognized or a state-recognized tribe, or it's just as a stakeholder group. Either way, it basically, like you said, self-identified. If they're interested, they should be included.
Yep, absolutely, 100%. And I don't believe in Colorado we have any officially state-recognized, but I think that everyone has been so comfortable with this process and this inclusion that CCIA and History Colorado has come up with this list of 48 that they're kind of an unofficial state-recognized group.
Right.
List, yeah.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, I guess to end out, is there a direction that you would like to see this type of work, this field, tribal consultation, etc., SHPO offices, whatever, that you would, a direction that you would like to see it go in the future, or any changes you would like to see, etc.?
Yes. So one of the things that I think is unfortunate in Colorado is we don't have any listed traditional cultural properties. And
really?
Yeah, and we have a lot of, we have a lot of listings. We have something like 26 NHLs. We have a really active National Register program, but I don't think we have any traditional cultural properties. And there's various reasons for that.
Formally on the National Register, you mean?
Right, yes.
Okay, because obviously there's quite a few, like the agencies, I'm sure, have quite a few that they haven't.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Right.
And I would, I would like to see us do more with, as a SHPO's office, I'd like to see us work more directly with tribes who might want to see those sorts of listings or who might want to seek different sorts of protections or interpretations or, whatever it is they might want from something like that, if anybody wants that. I'd also like, and we've been having these conversations in our office, I'd like us to be more active in how we discuss tribal consultation with our federal agencies. And there's a lot of different reasons that we haven't been more active in that. And some of it is, like we've talked about, it's their responsibility. At the end of the day, we can remind them. We could not sign an agreement if it wasn't done, things like that. But, we really don't intercede on it. But I think that there'd be a lot more mutual benefits if we could have more of those conversations. And I think the third thing is we do a pretty good job with mitigations and with different strategies of protecting and interpreting sites. But I can't help but think that there's always more creative ways that might benefit local communities. And so I would love to get more outside ideas from folks to kind of help us and to help agencies direct what's important about historic sites. What should we be looking for? Where should we be putting our resources and our time? And, what's the best way to protect these from a 106 point of view for the benefit of people, and not just checking off a box because it's our responsibilities. So those are the different sorts of things I'd like to see. And I'd like to think that we're working on those, but it's always incremental and small, and we could always use some more outside guidance and support.
Mm-hmm. So on that note, I guess, is there anything else that you want to bring to people's attention, or any resources out there that you would want to recommend people, etc.?
Yeah, so for folks who are interested in tribal consultation in Colorado, CCIA actually has a PDF online that's a state tribal consultation guide, an introduction for Colorado state agencies to conducting formal consultations with federally recognized American Indian tribes. And it's just really interesting because I think that it's a really good introduction to the culture of consultation the state of Colorado tries to approach, which is really collaborative and beneficial. And I think the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs is just a really great resource for tribal issues across the board, not just consultation on historic resources, but also like our office. I would love for more people to think about our office as a resource for all sorts of stuff. We're not just for federal agencies, even though we talked about that's the SHPO's role, but the Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation does a ton more than that. And we try to do a lot of outreach, and we try to do different sorts of educational programs and put out different resources. But I think at the end of the day, like, again, it sounds kitschy, but I really believe it. We work for the people of Colorado. And if there's something that people would like to see us do, or see us do differently, or be involved in, I would love to take those suggestions and have those conversations.
Great. So, I mean, for a lot of people, it seems like the SHPO is still this kind of big, scary thing that you don't contact directly. So how would someone go about contacting a SHPO?
Yeah, so we're just online. You can like Google my name, and everything you would ever want to know comes up, or you can just Google like archaeology in Colorado, and I think we come up. But we're not just the State Historic Preservation Office that does NHPA stuff. We also do state level stuff. Like I said, we also do educational programming. We work a lot with the museum. So historycolorado.org. You can find us on there. And people find me and email me or call me. I actually had a nice call from a gentleman earlier today who grew up in Colorado, is actually from Oklahoma, and he and his dad had been out on the Western Slope this weekend and had found something that they thought we could give them more information on, and was an interesting artifact. And the guy called me and emailed me a photo, and we had a nice conversation. So it can be that simple, or it can be, hey, I've got this cool idea for a project, or, we can help you find resources for that sort of thing. So we just want to be involved and help people learn about and protect their resources.
So I guess the takeaway for the day is, don't be scared of the SHPO.
No, we're not scary. We only yell at federal agencies. We don't yell at anybody else.
And to the federal agencies listening,
they're rolling their eyes right now because they're like, oh my God, Holly. They know I don't yell at them either.
Well, thank you so much, Holly, for coming on. Especially at the last minute, Holly was very generous in coming on after I had an issue with a episode that had already been recorded that didn't end up working out. So thank you for coming on, especially so last minute.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. This was really nice, and I love talking to you, and I love talking about archaeology, and I hope I didn't ramble too much.
It was great.
Fabulous, thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Heritage Voices podcast. You can find show notes at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/Heritage Voices. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or the Google Music Store. Also, if you like the show, please share with your friends or write us a review. If you have any questions, comments, or show suggestions, please reach out to me at jessica@livingheritageanthropology.org, or you can find me on Facebook through Living Heritage Anthropology or on Twitter @LivingHeritageA. As always, thank you to Lyle Blanqua and Jason Nez for their collaboration on our incredible logo.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
People just get so scared of tribal consultation.
They do. Well, and I think, going back to your first question from like an hour ago, I think that's like such a huge issue, because I think that's why they don't consult early enough, because they're scared that somebody's going to get mad at them. And so they put it off.
And then somebody gets mad at them.
Right, exactly. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, I am not an expert on tribal consultation. I have not done as much as other people. But I have like one rule, and that is just don't be a jerk. That's all they're looking for. They're looking any group, not just tribal consultation. Just be honest, be sincere, and just, do the best thing you can for the resources. And at the end of the day, it'll work out.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.